Okay, so for any of you who have just watched one of our tutorials on designing in Figma, here is the tutorial on how to prototype, which is kind of like a separate kind of like section of design once you're done with designing your low fidelity and high fidelity mockups. This is the time where you can join in and learn how to prototype using Figma specifically. Especially since some of you might be in this process at this point in the week for your own projects for the competition. But we'll just go over like how to prototype if you've never done it before. Also some like advanced techniques, or I would call them more intermediate techniques, just to get you started and play around with a bit more of a couple of fancy functions for your own prototype, or if you want to play around with prototypes that you create in the future as well. So prototyping, essentially, if you don't know what that means, is you're pretty much bringing your static designs to life. So essentially, like you already designed all your frames like you see here, like the example I have right now, you have it all colored in all the frames that you need to display all the features you want. And now it's time to put it all together. So now you can kind of play through it like an app. So it's kind of like a slideshow where you're playing and presenting through it. It's kind of the same idea where you're just bringing the content you have to life, and it allows other designers, other stakeholders, other engineers to better see how you as a designer envision this app to kind of go through. So once you're done designing, up here on the right-hand side, there's a prototyping tab, and that's where you want to set or you want to click on to set your workspace to begin to prototype. And you can also choose the type of device that you are planning on prototyping on. For this particular project, we prototyped on the iPhone 11 Pro, but there's a lot of other devices that you're able to choose from depending on the frames that you use. So we use the iPhone 11 Pro frame, so we're going to prototype on that device. And you can see here in the preview what that's going to look like when you play it or you present your design. So right now it's in a vertical mode, but you can also go horizontally, especially if you're designing something like games or slides or video related content where you want a wider screen. This is another option for you as well. But for this particular product that my friends and I made, we're going to keep it vertical. And then you can also change the model. Doesn't really do much, but it's just a nice preference to have. And also you can change the background too. So right now the background when you play it will be black. You can change it to any color you want, but we're just going to keep it as the default. And then down here you have pretty much like if you need a reminder on how to prototype or whatnot, these are just basic instructions for you to follow. Right, so with that being said, that's all the settings that you need before you start. And then so let's get started on exactly how you prototype. So you can select any frame that you want. And let me zoom in. So any frame, you can start prototyping here, and you'll see that there's like this little node. So this node allows you to connect this particular frame to any frame that you want. You'll notice that if I hover over all of these other elements of the frame, I can also prototype those elements too. So the difference here is if I prototype just the frame to another frame, I can just maybe like click on anywhere I want on the screen, or maybe I want to have like a timed animation where I just wait a couple seconds and then it'll just move on to the next screen. Anything of the sort is it's not constrained to any assets. I can just click anywhere on the screen. But if I want to say like I want to click on an actual element, so in this case, like it's better over here. Like if I want to click a button or a link or whatnot, I can just prototype that link to go to the next screen rather than like just prototyping this particular screen to the next screen. I can actually be more specific in terms of what I want the user to click on. So that's really nice. So pretty much the basic way is you can start click the node, and then just click and drag to the next screen. So what you'll see here is you'll see that this settings pop-up will appear, and this will let you play around with a lot of different features in terms of like how you envision the user to go to the next screen. So you can go on tap, which means you just click the screen or click the element or just tap it if it's mobile. You can drag it, you can hover your cursor over or hover your finger over if you want any animations to play out. Or you can have like a delay, like I mentioned, where you just wait a couple seconds and it goes over to the next frame. So a lot of different options here. These are pretty much the basic options that typical users will like interact with for certain features. So if there's any other ones that you can think of, Figma just doesn't have it quite yet. They just have these options, which are the most typical. And then here you can also tell your prototype where to navigate to. So usually I just want to go to the next frame, so I can just click navigate to, but in case there are any situations where I'm onboarding or any slides or whatnot. So for example, over here during the onboarding phase, there's a bunch of arrows that go back and forth. In theory, I can navigate back and forth when clicking each arrow, but there's also an option just to go back. So I don't have to create like another connection. Figma already recognizes that some features or some flows for certain features and screens that you want the users to interact with can have an option to like undo or go back. So that's really cool. So keep it at navigate to, and then if in case like there are some glitches or whatnot, you can manually select the frame that you want, which is kind of nice when you have named all of your frames, which is practice I highly suggest everyone start working on. And then you can also change the animation. So in this case, instant is like, think about a PowerPoint where you just click, you press your space bar, or you click or you press the next button, or you click your mouse and it just pops to the next slide. It's kind of the same idea where it just goes to the next frame. Or you can have anything fancy, like you can dissolve, you can move in, move out, slide in, push, whatnot. And then what's really cool about Figma is if you're not sure what these animations look like, Figma has a preview here. So you can kind of go through, play around on your own and see what type of animation you'd like. And you can also change a lot of the settings. So easing in, easing out, changing the directions of how each animation plays out, change the duration of everything. There's a lot of features here. One that I would like to note is something called Smart Animate. Basically what this is it's an animation feature where Figma will recognize more fancier, I guess like animations that you want to create. So things like micro interactions. Smart Animate would be a good feature to use to play that. Or anything where it's like, say you have like a loading bar and you want to prototype it in a way where the user can see the loading bar getting filled up. So like at 0% to 50% to 100%, if you're like downloading anything or if you're loading anything and you want to display that progress, Smart Animate is one way to do that for a certain feature. But if you want to do it for like a certain screen, I think the previous or like the original animation that my friend did on the screen was that they would have on delay this logo and the word mark Smart Animate upwards to reveal the login information. So a lot of different things that you can play around with Smart Animate. It will recognize a lot of different features or fancy features that you want to animate. There's a lot of different ways to use it. So I would highly recommend as you get more practice with prototyping, you can play around with Smart Animate a lot more. So this one, I'll just keep it at instant here. And that's pretty much like how to set up or just like how to create a basic connection is just click and drag and then set a bunch of features. Another kind of practice that I want everyone to get into the habit of is organizing your frames in a kind of in a clear manner that kind of goes along with your user flow. Not only will this help you better organize your frames and understand like what exactly to prototype or what you need to prototype, but it will get you in the mindset of thinking as a user when you're prototyping. So like here at the top, I want to start with, the logos, the login screens, the onboarding and account making phase. Then of course, you'll be navigated to the home page, and then from there, you're navigated to all the different features that your product has. So things like buying products versus looking at resources versus checking out versus signing up for like events or reservations or whatnot, or making reservations. All these different features, like right now, you see here that we have them all, like all the similar frames within the same space. So it just better organizes the layout and also helps you think through the user flow a bit easier. So just a note on organizing before you prototype. And then another thing here is you might see this weird box. So this is a practice that my friends and I got into. I think it makes it easier. So it's something I would suggest, but totally up to you if you want to organize this in another way. But we have a box for our components and other assets that we are prototyping. And so you'll see here, all our headers and navigation bars are here. And I'll go over this later on how to do this, but essentially, as a designer, your job is not to do anything like 1,000 times. It's not busy work at all. It should not be. Your work should be meaningful, but you should not be doing anything like manually 1,000 times. It's kind of like Excel. If you're doing anything, if you're plugging any function in one by one, there should be some sort of feature that lets you do that automatically. So it's the same thing for design. And what I mean by here is when you're prototyping all of these screens, especially for something like a navigation bar, if you're prototyping, you might be thinking, oh, every time for every screen, I want the user, when they click on this home icon, to be navigated to the home screen. But that means I have to make this connection for every single screen and all these icons, like I have to go in one by one and do that. That is not the case. Okay, that you shouldn't be doing that. There is an easier way so that you can do a lot more important stuff than spending hours just prototyping the same icon to the same frame. And this is especially the case when you're working with over 50 frames. You don't want to be spending your whole time doing that. So what you can do is create a component, which is essentially, like we mentioned in the last Figma or intro to Figma in the design portion, where you make an asset and then you can create copies of those assets by making the original a component, and any change you make to the component will be reflected in all the copies. So it's the same thing with prototyping, where if you prototype or if you make a connection in the component, it will be reflected with all the copies you make. So the originals are all in this box, and all the navigation bars in our frames are copies. So all the connections that we make like we can just click and drag one time for the home icon to the home page, and all these other frames will reflect that as well. So once you create your connections, you will get something that looks like this. It looks a bit daunting, it looks a bit crazy. I will break it down, I promise. But like I mentioned before, let me just click one of these. Whoops. So with here, with one navigation bar, I just set them, or like my teammates and I set them to, if you click on any of these icons, it'll go to like the frames that are needed. And then when I click out of it, if I click like on a copy of the frame, it'll be reflected. Or those connections that I made in the original will be reflected here, and I didn't have to do it one by one. So this is what it looks like in terms of like the actual prototype. And then I will actually like make a very low quality mockup of one so that you see it better. That's essentially what it looks like. A lot of lines, a lot of everything. And then one thing to note is like when you start a prototype, you are able to set like the starting frame. But if in case like something happens where like maybe you need to override the setting, like usually Figma will understand that where you start prototyping, you ideally would want to start at that screen, but in case something happens or that's not the case, you can also manually set like where you want the flow or like where you want your prototype to start prototyping from. So that's pretty nice in case like any hiccups happen, you have that option with you. So we go back here, and I think the easiest, for me, the easiest way to kind of show how to prototype is I'll just prototype through these screens here, just so you have a better understanding of what that looks like. It's easier just to see as I do it. So here is the flow. Oops. Okay. And then from here, I want the user to, ideally, I would want them to log in, but because this is like a new app, I'm thinking in the mindset of a new user. They don't have an account just yet. So I want them to click here to go to the next frame. And then you'll always see like that pop-up setting will come up. But at this point, I'll just leave it as is, just so you see. And here, you want them to fill all their names. So what you can do is that you can have them click just their first name, and then it'll just, you don't have, like prototypes aren't actually the actual product itself. Users aren't going to actually be able to type anything, but with a tap, you can just let them know that this is the place where you want them to enter information. It'll just go to the next screen. But if you want to add more options, like they can tap anywhere, you can prototype all these options, but I usually like to do at least 2. So it looks something like this. So they can tap either full name or phone number and go to the next screen. Then continue, all the information is in, to go to the next screen. Here is the onboarding phase. So I want to go, whoops, for them to tap on this arrow to go to this screen. Here as well, go to the next screen. And then, oops, I can also, if in case they want to read things again, they can go back. So in this case, this is an example of just like creating another connection to navigate to this past screen. But I think in this case, I also have the option to go back on tap. Sometimes it works. I think Figma has fixed a couple bugs on there, but just in case when I play it, I'll just have the arrow go back here. Same thing with this one, just so when I play it, you can see it without any issues. And then they're done with the onboarding stage, and let's go goes to the home screen. So if I play this, okay, so this is what it will look like here. Sometimes because I have 2 flows right now, the sidebar appears, but I'm gonna just take that out for right now. When you submit a prototype to like another person to view, this is what they're seeing. And then the circle is where you can see their cursor at. So in this case, I just want to click on the screen, goes to the next frame. And if, say, like you are someone who's looking at another person's prototype and you're not sure where to click, you can just click outside of the frame, and the prototype will show you like the hotspot where the designer intended for you to click on. So it's like, oh, am I supposed to log in or am I supposed to create a new account? I'm not sure. And you can see right now, as I'm tapping the like the space around the phone, it highlights where the designer wanted me to click. So sign up here. And then just to make sure, yes, I want to click either or, then click continue. Next, I can click either go back, and I can go back to the next or to the previous frame as well. And we click let's go. And then we're at the home page. This is the most basic prototyping feature where it's just instant and it just goes to the next screen. You might think that it's pretty robotic, right? It's not necessarily the most natural way that you would want a user to go about your app. It's kind of like pressing these arrows down here, or like, a PowerPoint where you're just going through the slides and going through the frames, or just tapping or hitting your arrow keys. That's literally what it feels like. So if you want to create a more dynamic experience or a more natural experience with your prototype, that's where animations come in, and that's where you can make things a bit more fancy as you prototype. So let's try that. We can keep this on tap here, but for something like this, where maybe you want things to slide in, let's see what that looks like. Okay, and then if I want to start from this frame, I can just highlight it and play it. And the cool thing about any changes that you make on Figma specifically is that any changes you make in terms of the prototype or the design, when you play it, you don't have to like reload this tab. It's going to change your final design in real time. So you'll see, I didn't have to reload it, and it goes, there's like a new animation that plays. There it is again, right? So in this case, we had kind of this previous frame moves back and the next frame slides in. If that's what you want, feel free to go for it. If you want a different type of animation, you can play around with the different types as well. I think in my case, if I were to do something like this, where it's just arrows and you have the same elements of like a illustration and text, and then these 3 dots, I'd probably want a smoother transition rather than like the whole frame itself sliding, but up to you and how you want to design. And then let me also play through this first frame just to see how, like, what a more natural way of prototyping this type of product would look like. Okay, you see it smart animates up, you see, and then the word mark and the logo move up and reveal the login information. And then everything here, we just had it slide, the actual like content slide. And let's go, and then everything just shoots down, and then we are to the home page. So that's a way where you can make it a bit more dynamic rather than like very robotic and static like a PowerPoint. And if you want to know what these settings are here, so this one, I believe we smart animated it. Oops. Yes, smart animate to ease out. And then the other notable ones are here. We just had the animation slide in on tap. Nothing too fancy, that's all we had. And then this big one where it just shot down, we had it move out, going downwards, and you can always preview to see what that would look like. Okay. That is what that would look like. Okay, and then let's go through a couple advanced tips on like any fancier features that you want to design. So what I mentioned before was creating components. So let me create one really quick. So say you have a header or like a nav bar with icons in it. Oops. Want to duplicate the actual shape. There we go. Okay, cool. I can make this a component like you would in a button or whatnot. Create copies. And let me also make frames to size so you can just imagine what it would look like with a phone frame. Okay, so something like this. Let's move this out of the way first. And space these out so you can see. And then all these would be at the bottom, and the squares would represent like the icons. So every time the user clicks on this first icon, I want them to be navigated to the first screen. Then with the same with the second and same with the third. So I did this only once on this component, but if I click out, ooh, there you go. So if I click into the first frame, you'll see that same thing happens. The first icon goes to the first frame, second one goes to the second, third goes to the third, and the same thing happens with each of these as well. Oops. And so I only did that once. I don't have to do that multiple times. I don't have to go in one by one to do it. It's all here, and I didn't have to spend my time doing like tedious work like that. So that's what I mean by creating components. It just makes your life a lot easier. Another thing to note is let's talk about responsive design for scrolling content. So what does this mean? Say I have a phone frame that's kind of like tall and skinny versus something that's a bit shorter. Whoops. Maybe it's a bit wider too. We'll do something like that. Okay. So we have two different screen sizes here, which is really common with all the different types of phones that we have, and tablets and devices, everything of the sort. There's a lot of frames to work with, right? And say we are looking at maybe a shopping app where we have a different product placements in a grid. So something that's kind of like, let me move up here. Maybe you're seeing it by twos, right? You're seeing something like this, where you have like products, and as you're scrolling down, you're seeing it 2 by 2 by 2. So you can imagine that, right? So with all these product placements and product listings, maybe you already spent a lot of time, tweaking out all the tiny details, like how far these are spaced apart from each other, how far these are spaced out to each other, and you have that already set, right? And you can drag it and put it in this frame. So when I talk about scrolling content, so this all these product placements, right? When you play a frame, you're able to extend this frame to either see all of this content, all of these product listings, or you can just have it kind of going beyond the dimensions of the frame so that when you do play it, you can actually scroll. So let me see if I can play this to show you what I mean. So here I can click and drag and it will scroll through, you'll be able to scroll through all these product listings, right? So the issue is if I am moving to another sized, a different sized frame or for a different device, the layout is not going to be, it might not look the same, right? Especially if you're moving from like a phone to a tablet to a desktop application. Desktop applications, you're not viewing, you're not scrolling through 2x2s, right? You're scrolling maybe like in a grid of, I don't know, 5 to 7 on downwards. There's a lot more per row. So how do I, as a designer, navigate that, right? Do I have to kind of reset all of these one by one and respace it out all one by one? Of course not. That's not what you should be doing as a designer. That's tedious work. So what you can do is place all this content in its own frame. So you're going to essentially be thinking like it's a frame within a frame. So all this sized, and you can place it in a frame here and resize to your heart's content, right? And then if you, let's see, let's say, let me in case make this a bit smaller so you can see. Move it like that. So it's a lot easier to see. So you can have it in like its own section. So essentially you're designing the content section by section. And this is the section of product listings. And you might have like filters at the top and like other information at the bottom. And you're just sectioning your designs and separating it all by frames. So if I want to move from like this particular frame size to like maybe a wider and shorter frame size, I can just scale this whole section smaller or larger or however much I want. So let's say this is like a much bigger frame like this. So obviously this frame is not going to cut it. It is way too small, and I can scale it up to look like that. So all my settings in terms of my sizing, placement, if I added photos in here already, that's all done. I don't have to change it again and move one by one, move these listings one by one. I can just move it all as a whole section. Does that make, I hope that makes sense. Okay, and then next one is time delays. So the same thing that I mentioned about loading screens. And then let me change this color. Something like this. And then let me also change these colors. Whoops. So you can better see what it looks like. Okay, so say you click on something and you have a screen that loads right now, right? So what you can do if you want to make any sort of micro interactions or frames or whatnot, there is a way to like animate this feature so that you can see this taskbar or like loading bar or whatever increase in length and be like 0% or however many percent complete to like 50% to like 100. What you would have to do is create a bunch of frames and put all of these in. So in this case, you can either create like, you can either make all of these frames by grouping both sections. Let me do that real quick. Right-clicking and framing the selection and having this particular selection play through these frames, or you can just do it by frames itself. This might be easier as a beginner as well. And you can smart animate this so that, you know, everything else is the same. The only thing that's changing are these bars, and Figma will recognize that, and you'll be able to animate this particular feature. There we go. So that, oops, group that together. So that's one way where you can add in micro interactions, and you can play around with like different ways to smart animate things. And I'll go over another example in another project. But this is just an example of like, if you want to make a loading screen, there's other examples of like, the one I will go through is if you hover and you want like this, a product listing or a thumbnail to get bigger. Like I mentioned yesterday with the design trends with micro interactions, or with like the arrow animation where you hover over it and it gets longer. I'll play through that as well so you can see, but you can smart animate, and essentially this is what you would do. You can either frame all of these and go play through each of these frames, or make like the whole frame itself and play through all these frames here. All right. And then Figma now lets you create multiple flows in each file. They used to not be able to. So what people would do, it would be to create like a table of contents for, say, if you were to do light mode versus dark mode and play through it. If you have any issues or glitches with making multiple flows, what this would look like if you want to create a table of contents, whoops, is, I need this to be a frame. Okay, you can have like a thumbnail or whatnot where it says light mode versus dark mode. Make this a bit darker so you can see. And then essentially you would prototype according to these different flows. So from here, you would just, your table of contents frame would appear first. And then if you would want to like have someone view your design in light mode, you can have like light mode in text here. It'll go to the first frame that you have in light mode versus dark mode. It'll go to the first frame. And then you can just continue on with prototyping through your light mode screens and also through your dark mode screens. So that was a way that people used to create like both light and dark mode on the same file. You should be able to create multiple flows in a Figma file, but just in case, this is another option for you to display multiple flows in one file. All right, and then with testing, the last thing I want to mention is something called observation mode. So as you're looking through a prototype, or like as you send out your prototypes to get tested and feedback from, if it's really easy to like send this out and have a user interview to kind of have someone else play through your designs and see where they have trouble navigating to, and where they are not understanding like certain features. So one great thing that Figma has specifically is something called observation mode, which is you can send your Figma file to another person, and they can, like in your head, you would be like, oh, they would share screen with me on Zoom or Discord or whatnot, and I can just watch them. But if, say, like you don't have any of those platforms, Figma has a feature in the product itself where you can view what the other person is looking at. So if multiple people are on a file, you'll see their icons appear. Right now it's just me, so you only see my icon. But like say like another person comes, it'll just appear right next to it, and you can click on their profile and you'll just see what they're seeing. So even if you're on the first screen yourself. If you click on the other person, you can just watch them as they move through all your frames and play through it. So that's a really nice feature when you're conducting user testing with your prototype. For this particular project, you will not have to, I don't expect you to, and none of the other judges expect you to, but this is for like down the line when you want to create a fully fleshed out prototype or for a bigger project. That is something that I would suggest you do and make use of this feature for. And so just to show you like what a really big project looks like, because this particular project, although there's like a lot of like frames, this was also for like a design jam or a design-a-thon event. So there's not that many frames here, but for something that's bigger, this is one of my projects for a capstone research project for one of my classes. And it's a lot of frames. I think it's over 100 if I remember right, and a lot of connections. So again, organized in the layout of what I want my user to go through and how I want them to think about, like navigating through this is a website, how I want them to navigate through my website. And yeah, it's a lot. So we still have the same kind of component bucket here with all the assets and the header for all the icons for all the pages that we want. And the reason why you see a lot of the same frame here is for the animations we made. So for something like a button, so say I want to prototype a button where you hover over it and it fills to let you know that you can click on it. That's what we did here. So you would want to create the exact same frame for both like home pages for in this case. And I wanted this feature to happen to the sign-in button. So it would be the exact same with the exception that just the sign-in buttons were different. So one is unfilled, one is filled. And when I prototype, I want them to hover over that button. So I prototype just from that button to the next screen. I click on it. So while hovering, that's what I want. Navigates to the next page, smart animate, and then I clicked ease out, which would ease out back, which if I play this, so when I hover over it, it fills in with color, which is pretty cool. And if I take my mouse off of it, it stops from happening. And it just doesn't go through like formally through the frames. It's just like an animation of like, oh, I just wanted to animate this one button rather than like the whole like homepage itself. So that's one example of like how you can make something a bit more dynamic. Another thing we did is down here where we wanted to make the thumbnails on hover to be to expand or get bigger. So here you'll see it's the same frame, but the only exception for like this, say this particular thumbnail, it is prototyped to this frame where everything's the exact same except the image for this particular thumbnail gets a bit larger. And it's the same type of prototyping settings where it's on hover, smart animate, ease out, and then what this looks like. Let me just skip through. To that screen right here. So for this particular thumbnail, I hover over it and it gets larger. And it's the same thing for all the other thumbnails that we added here. And same type of like hover on the buttons, and then it'll get colored in to let you know you can click on it. And then same for all these thumbnails up here. And then for the arrow feature I talked about, so we have a see more button where, or like link, where if you hover over it, it gets larger. So it's the same idea here. It's two frames, which are exactly the same. and one has the see more with this smaller arrow, and then one has see more with a larger arrow. Same exact prototyping settings, and then you can make it dynamic and have it animate like this, which is kind of cute. So to create all those animations, we had to make frames for each one of those animations, which takes a long time, but it just makes your prototype a bit more interesting as a user, kind of like using it and scrolling through. Another one is if you create, say, like drop-down boxes. You can also smart animate for everything to move down on its own. So this is not coded or anything. This is just smart animation on Figma. So this is what it looks like as you click through it. Everything just adjusts to size. It's exactly the same in terms of like the format and the content, but we had to create a separate frame for each of the questions in the FAQ section. And yeah, that's just a couple ways you can use Smart Animate. And then this is like to give you an idea of what a larger scale project looks like. Right. I think that is it for prototyping. It's pretty straightforward in terms of you just connect nodes and form connections with arrows everywhere and just have all the frames just line up together. But if you want to create anything fancier, we went over a couple more intermediate techniques for you to make your prototype more dynamic. And that's pretty much it. There's not much to prototyping besides just making connections and just making things a bit more fancy. And then when you play it, it should play pretty smoothly. I will say, like, if you do choose to smart animate anything, and if you notice that the whole frame is changing instead of like a certain feature, so like with the FAQ section, if you're noticing that instead of just the bars moving, you're noticing the whole screen is moving, that just means there's something on the screen that's not exactly the same. If you want to smart animate something like those micro interactions or something like an FAQ section or whatnot that I showed, you want to make sure that the frames are exactly the same, except for the parts that you want to animate. So that just means there's something, maybe an alignment issue or anything that there's something that's not exactly the same. It might be grouped wrong together, or it might be formatted wrong. That's just something to catch. And I think that is all the content that I have. Let me double check. Yes. So this is what you'll be turning in for the end of the night on Friday. You'll be turning in a link to your prototype. And for us judges, we'll just be playing through and seeing how we can navigate through your product. So this has been how to prototype using Figma. I hope you guys all found it helpful, and good luck for the rest of the competition. Until next time.